Well, good afternoon and welcome to our lunchtime program from my point of view. I'm Deborah Burke, the Acting Director for Education here at Gilcrease, and it's my pleasure to introduce these monthly informal talks on parts of our collection and also on special exhibition components that we actually present to you. Today's speaker is Laura Stevens, the Associate Professor of English and Editor of Tulsa Studies in Women's Literature at the University of Tulsa. She's a past president of the South Century Society for 18th Century Studies, currently the Vice President of the Society of Early Americanists, and next week will begin a 2-year term as the Society's president. Stevens is the author of the book, The Poor Indians, British Missionaries, Native Americans, and Colonial Sensibility, as well as many articles on the literature of the 17th and 18th centuries, with a focus on early feminist thought, religious discourse, portrayals of American Indians, and the transatlantic circulation of texts, people, and ideas. She's currently writing a book called Friday's Tribe, 18th Century Missionary Fantasies. Dr. Stevens received both master and doctorate degrees in English from the University of Michigan, and today's lecture is the result of her research in the Gilcrease Museum Archives on a particular novel. So please help me welcome Dr. Laura Stevens.
Well, hello. Thank you, Deborah, for inviting me to speak today, and thank you for that very kind introduction. And thanks to all of you for showing up on this increasingly hot Friday to hear my talk. What I'd like to do today is tell you a story about 2 discoveries. First, of a book I found in the summer of 2009 among the Gilcrease holdings. And second, of learning what that book, published in 1748, had to say to me and to other scholars of 18th century Britain and its colonies. Now, when I use the word discovery, I don't mean to suggest that I found a text no one knew existed, or that was known to exist but had been lost. This is not a story about running across a missing copy of the Declaration of Independence, a lost composition of Mozart, or a play Shakespeare was thought to have written but was never put into print. My discovery is more along the lines of the one Edgar Allan Poe describes in his detective story, The Purloined Letter, in that it was an object hiding in plain sight. It differs even from this story, though, in that no one was looking for this text. It was there in the Gilcrease and in many other rare book libraries, including, it turns out, McFarland Special Collections. It was even available in a published facsimile and in the online database, 18th Century Collections Online. It was there for all to see, but no one had looked at it. There was nothing published on this novel. When I showed up in the old reading room of the Sarah Irwin Library some 6 years ago, I wasn't quite sure what I was looking for. A few years earlier, I had published a book on British missionaries' depictions of American Indians. I'm putting the cover up here because you may recognize the cover art. And while I had moved on to a rather different second book, I was still interested in learning about the texts that anticipated, recorded, and responded to religious interactions between English colonists and North American Indians. My understanding had been that the Gilcrease collections focused on the 19th and early 20th centuries, especially on the Cherokee, Creek, and other so-called civilized tribes who were forcibly removed to Oklahoma. I had heard comments in passing, though, that earlier materials connected with my era of study were included in the collection, and so I decided to take a look. Here is where I started my exploration, an authentic, old-fashioned card catalog, which is still present in the new Zero reading room of the Helmerich Center for American Research, just next door, even though only a few drawers are in use. This was a practical necessity, and so here's one of the drawers with some of the finding aids over in the Gilcrease collections. This approach was a practical necessity because the Gilcrease holdings were not cataloged online, but there are also pleasures and advantages to this paper-based approach. These drawers, photographed here along with some manuscript finding aids, include records of all printed material in the Gilcrease holdings. Some of the drawers are organized by year, and as I was only interested in materials published before 1800 for my purposes, a relatively small segment of the holdings, I decided to spend some time reading every entry in the drawer leading up to 1800. This is how I ran across this rather minimalist record, listing only an author, a title, a city of publication, and a year. The title, with its echo of Bunyan's famous emblematic narrative of 1678, The Pilgrim's Progress, intrigued me. Here is a copy of an early edition from the Folger Library. So this intrigued me, along with its reference in the title to an Indian convert, a topic at the center of my long-standing research interests. I moved over to a second set of card catalog entries, organized alphabetically, and here I found a more detailed entry with a subtitle, publishing information, and catalogers or booksellers' notes, along with keyword entries. In this entry, I found hints of a fascinating juxtaposition between description and content, as the keyword terms and descriptions suggested by a non-fictional account, a journal, listed under description and travel, along with the purported author's names, and tantalizing suggestions that what I was really looking at was an entry for a novel. What were those suggestions? Well, there was the improbable name Hatem Galashman, sounding little like the native names I had encountered in colonial-era records. But there were also what I might call signal words in the title, such as faithful account. It is helpful to keep in mind that early novels rarely advertise themselves as novels. The vast majority, especially before mid-century, mid-18th century, were published anonymously as a true, faithful, sometimes strange and surprising account, a history, or a life, with a first-person narrator often listed as the author. The full title of Robinson Crusoe, often cited as the first true novel, is, as you can see here, the life and strange, surprising adventure of Robinson Crusoe of York, Mariner, with the subtitle presenting a fairly detailed narrative. Notice also Defoe does not appear on this. This is one reason why establishing the canon of early authors like Defoe is very challenging. Roxana, or The Fortunate Mistress, another novel attributed to Defoe, has as its full title, The Life and Adventures of Roxana, the Fortunate Mistress, or Most Unhappy Wife, presenting itself as a biography through its intricate narrative subtitle, as you can see on this slide. Samuel Richardson, a printer who turned to writing with great success, published his first novel, Pamela, with himself listed as the editor of some, quote, found letters. The subtitle stresses not only that unlike scintillating romances, often criticized by preachers and other more morally inclined folk, this text would, quote, cultivate the principles of virtue in its readers, but also that it has its, quote, foundation in truth. Richardson's second novel, Clarissa, or The History of a Young Lady, published in the same year as The New Pilgrim's Progress, and still the longest novel in the English language, presented itself to the public less as a novel than an advice manual, showing the distress that may attend the misconduct of both parents and children. It is not exactly that novelists actively set out to deceive their readers with these titles, or that their readers were always or even often deceived, so much as that the conventions of writing, publishing, realism, and reading were quite different from what they are today. From their early years, readers today are often taught to distinguish between fiction and nonfiction books. These are two of the first categories children learn about when they're reading, so that they are sorted into different sections in libraries and bookstores, and authors are heavily penalized when they present one sort of writing as the other. This was most decidedly not the case in the 18th century. As the scholar Leonard Davis notes in his study of early novels, when the words fact and fiction are used, they are not defining two distinct and unimpeachable categories. They are more properly extremes of a continuum. Perceptions, experience, fantasy, and belief are all gradations on the same scale. They are also, of course, devices of salesmanship, trying to engage the interests of the early modern reader. We might, as a parallel, think about the place of so-called reality TV in our modern world. Scholarship over the past 30 years or so has illuminated how novels and the reader's appetites for them both grew out of the publishing and consuming of several other genres in the 17th and 18th centuries, including obviously fictional ones such as romances, and purportedly non-fictional ones like newspapers, advice literature, conversion narratives, and accounts of foreign lands. Novels emerge from this mishmash of genres and their conflicting truth claims. When, in the title of my talk, I describe fiction masquerading as fact, I use that term because it encompasses less an effort at outright deceit and manipulation than the playful performance, the knowing wink and nod that accompany the rituals of donning costumes and pretending to be someone else. We might think of early novels as operating in that way. Such novels were taken, at least initially, as true, but many were not. At the same time, the claim to be true, faithful, surprising, and strange added to the novel's appeal, in the same way that a TV episode purportedly ripped from the headlines does today. When viewed against the backdrop of 18th century novel titling conventions, the new Pilgrim's Progress looked to me a great deal like a novel. I was eager to look at it, and while putting in a request to have the book brought to the reading room, I went online to consult a really helpful resource called the English Short Title Catalog. This online catalog, based on two monumental bibliographies developed in the mid-20th century, provides brief entries according to the best practices of descriptive cataloging of almost every English language text printed between 1473 and 1800. Hosted by the University of California, Riverside, and by the British Library, it is freely accessible to the public. Some of the great offerings of this catalog are that it lists every known printing or edition of a given text from all reporting libraries, that it provides details about the physical dimensions and pagination, and that it includes a list of every library known to possess a copy, along with facsimile and microfilm versions. Now, as this slide indicates, when I searched this title in the ESTC, I discovered that the book had two editions with two printings each. So we have the first in 1748, quickly in a second printing, and then again 1792. The text was first published by W. Owen, his print shop was located here on Fleet Street, near the Temple Bar, which is where the lawyers were. This is striped 1720 map of London, so you can recognize the Thames here. And this was a relatively typical place for a print shop to be located within the city of London. Here is a close-up. The print shop, located at the sign of Homer's Head, as it says on the title page. Remember, this was before London had what we would consider proper street addresses. So the addresses are always near the sign of this or that. Was active from 1740 through the 18th century, with over 1,000 imprints on diverse topics. I could not, in my first search, find out much more about the London printer or the regional one in Somersetshire, so I looked at a more detailed version of the catalog entry for the first edition. Here's what I learned from this page. First, I could get some sense of what the book looks like. So you can see here, physical description. It indicates that it's 316 pages long and of relatively small dimensions. This 12 with the 0 indicates, does anyone know? It means a duodecimal. So in the early modern period, a printer would have a single sheet of paper to work with. And so if a sheet was just printed on one side, you had a broadside, and you'd hang it up like a poster. A folio was just a page printed like this, and then folded and bound down the middle. Then, if you want to have a smaller book, and often a cheaper book, you fold the page into fourths, and you have a quarto. And you print the pages accordingly. Some of them are upside down when they're printed. You fold them, you stitch it here, and then you cut the pages, right? And then a duodecimo then folds that fourth 3 times. So it's a small book, right? Why is that important? It's kind of neat information, right? Okay. Now, it is in sum a small, informal, and I would say relatively inexpensive book, although the price is not listed on the title page. Basically a pocketbook, a typical size for a novel. Even long novels like Clarissa tended to be of smaller page dimensions, with the story extending into several volumes. My interest was piqued yet more. The ESTC also showed me that the book was relatively widely available. You can see here a list of libraries. I only have the first few here. It was a total of 14 reported ownership of a first edition. Interestingly, it does not include the Gilcrease. So more indication that the world at large does not know what treasures the collection contains. As well as the information that it exists in microform or microfiche, and even a paper facsimile issued in 1974. This all made me wonder, it's so available, relatively speaking, why has no one written about it? Why have I never heard about it? Clicking on a later edition, I found here an octavo. That AO means an octavo. So that's a printer's sheet folded into 8 pages. So slightly larger, but still a small edition. And I've lost my place. Let's see here. That was printed in Lancashire, England in 1792. And it revealed to my surprise that this text was available in McFarlane. What was this book, and why had I never heard of it? By this time, the actual physical book had arrived in the reading room, so I opened it eagerly. Here is a photograph of the cover page. This book was in excellent physical condition with a relatively simple cardboard binding. At least that is my memory of it. The material condition of a book can provide helpful, if sometimes ambiguous, information for a researcher to consider. It tells us, of course, something about the conditions of a book's storage and treatment over time, but also about its ownership and readership. The books that were most often and most voraciously read within everyday lives of the readers. Almanacs, for example, or primers, or cookbooks. Some Bibles, not the big church Bibles or the formal family Bibles, but little prayer books and little pocket Bibles. They tend often not to have lasted long enough to be collected by later generations. They fell to pieces. They were read to death. And the copies that have survived to exist in rare book collections often look a little beat up. They were treated as ephemera, texts important to the present moment, but not meant to last. Rather like the well-thumbed magazines we find today in your average doctor's office or salon. Texts published as expensive collector's items, such as grand folio printings of an author's magnus opus. Here's a page from the wonderful, expensive first edition of Dryden's translation of the works of Virgil, which the printer Jacob Tonson published by subscription with elaborate cuts or engravings, is one example. Such books were printed to last and be artfully bound and placed on shelves. Those who purchased them would tend to invest in expensive bindings. Remember that books, like cars, people would buy books like we buy cars, in that the books tended to be bought just as lightly stitched pages without covers, and then the buyer would pay extra for the binding, right? And some, of course, wealthy aristocrats, they might have all the books in their library bound in the same way with, say, the family crest on the cover. So the simple binding of the copy in the Gilcrease was, for me, also in keeping with its status as a humble novel. The good condition of this particular copy was also in keeping with its relatively obscure status, suggesting perhaps, a very tentative, perhaps, a book not often or eagerly read. I must stress, though, that this is not a conclusion one can make upon seeing one copy. It is more a kind of conclusion a scholar will come to after studying many copies in many rare book libraries. I turned to the first page and found a slight surprise, an introduction with rhetoric more in keeping with the introduction to a set of sermons or a theological tract, right? So this is hardly a novel of the bodice ripper genre. It's much more sober fare. In fact, though, this introduction matched some of the blurring of genres that is visible in the title page. You may remember that there is, at the bottom, you may have noticed an uncited reference to a Bible verse, Matthew 11:15, "He that hath ears, let him hear." There are references, of course, to baptism and conversion, and the allusions to Bunyan's spiritual allegory. It was typical for mid-century novels to make references to morals and conduct, partly to sidestep accusations that novels corrupted young readers' morals. It's kind of like claims that children's TV shows are educational, right? The references to baptism and conversion were hardly unprecedented, but less typical for this time. The text seemed even more mysterious than its catalog entry had suggested. So I read the novel. The story does not render the text any less bizarre. The New Pilgrim's Progress, or the Pious Indian Convert, tells the story of its narrator, a man named James Walcott. He's a young Anglican clergyman who, feeling called to convert the heathens of America, emigrates from England to Jamaica. There, he nearly triggers an uprising among the slaves by telling slaves he believes slavery to be unjust. And then he spends several months hiding out from the local white folk. His friend who captains a ship bails him out and sails him to Charlestown, South Carolina, where he becomes personal chaplain to a wealthy landowner and assists the local rector in his ministry. Several episodes, ranging from the poignant to the humorous and bizarre, all praising the Anglican Church in America, fill this narrative. But the novel's title is focused on the final episode, which only lasts about 40 of the 316 pages. This involves a young Asian slave, Hatem Galashman. He is described in the text at times as Chinese and as Indian. The text does not really decide. He has been transported to South Carolina through unusual circumstances. The British have captured a Spanish galleon in the Atlantic, found him on the galleon, and transported him to South Carolina. He's been bought by the landowner to whom Walcott is chaplain. The landowner gives him to Walcott as his ward. Walcott, having anticipated Galashman's arrival through a series of dream visions, converts and educates this Asian Indian, baptizes him, and approves. So over the course of a few years, he baptizes him, and then he is ordained as an Anglican minister, and then approves his journey inland to convert a tribe of American Indians, the fictional Chekbato, which seems to be a fictionalization of Cherokee, given the geographical location. This tribe converts in like a matter of weeks. It's very funny. And then they are attacked by a neighboring tribe, the Galengwa, for their Christian conversion. Appended to the novel is Galashman's own narrative, which includes an account of his mission and a description of his allegorical dream vision at the very end, which brings us back to Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which is also a dream vision. What was I to make of this unusual and improbable narrative? After first reading this novel, I began a process of exploration, interpretation, and some speculation, which culminated in the publication of an article in 2012. And this work will also be in the book that I'm working on. Basically, what I came to argue is that the novel is an episodic narrative, so a bunch of episodes strung together, harnessed to a grab bag of proposals for remedying various problems faced by the Church of England in the Atlantic arena. It is a sort of novel as propaganda. The Church of England was, as its name indicates, the State Church of England. Attendance was basically required of everyone. Taxes supported parishes, which also served as units of state government, such as aid to the poor. Since 1690, Protestant dissenters had been allowed legally to exist within England, rather than being actively persecuted. So as long as they had taken oaths of loyalty to the monarch, they could exist outside the bounds of the state church, worshiping in their own way, educating children in their own schools. But they were barred from university, from government office, and thus from most avenues of entrance to the realms of the elite and the powerful. The Church of England had a sort of monopoly control in England on religion. The North American colonies, however, presented a very different situation, with only a few, such as Virginia, designating the Anglican faith as the legally established one. The colonies presented a scene of almost market-based competition for the Church of England, which was badly outnumbered by dissenters, who really couldn't properly be called dissenters in the colonies, right? And poorly organized for long-distance operations. The 1730s and 40s also was the time of the Great Awakening, an evangelical revival that swept through Anglican as well as other Protestant churches, with an intensely emotional model of spiritual experience, a call to rapid, dramatic forms of conversion and commitment to Christ, and a mode of worship that in some ways threatened the authority of ministers. It is thus fitting that the narrator of the New Pilgrim's Progress, James Welcott, is filled with comments on several problems faced by the Anglican Church in the colonies. He bemoans the poverty and thus political dependency of ministers sent to Jamaica, the plague of deism or freethinking, the flaws of Presbyterianism and what he calls enthusiasm, and the need for more and better qualified chaplains on sea vessels. His ministry indicts and dissenters and vindicates the Church of England, as for example, when he preaches to a really excellent character named Erwin the Scotsman, a fanatical Presbyterian who's a sailor on the ship that transports him. He is, of course, red-headed, blustery, and short-tempered, whom Walcott eventually wins over to a more tolerant, rational, even-tempered form of Christianity. The biggest issue to which the novel responds, though, is the Church of England's failure to have done more to Christianize African slaves and Native Americans, especially in South Carolina. A little more historical background here is necessary. Here is a map from the Gilcrease published in Ellis Husk's book, The Present State of North America, in 1755, and beautifully engraved by Thomas Kitchin, who was later hydrographer to the king. Now you can see here, can't seem to get the, here we go. So here's North Carolina, here's South Carolina, here's Georgia, and what do we have down here? Can anyone read that?
Spanish.
The southern part of South Carolina, also known as Florida, right? So notice how the map boldly erases the Spanish territory of Florida by renaming it the south part of South Carolina. Anyway, interesting trivia. So you can see where South Carolina is. Within 5 decades of its 1670 founding, South Carolina, established largely by former residents of Barbados, who sought to export its system of large-scale plantation slave labor, had twice as many African slaves as white residents. Whoops. Even as black and white populations grew, the native populations plummeted. The historian Peter Wood has estimated the decline from 10,000 in 1685 to 1,500 in 1745, with some 40,000 black residents and 20,000 white in the same year. The colony protected itself from rebellions through terror tactics honed in the West Indies, and it prevented alliances between Indians and Africans by paying guns to local tribes for escaped African or newly captured Indian slaves. So it would basically pay the local tribes to fight each other, and with bounties for captives. These efforts were quite successful, although 9 years before the publication of the New Pilgrim's Progress, a group of Congolese slaves, at least some of whom were Roman Catholic or had incorporated elements of Catholicism into their belief structure, had killed more than 20 whites in Charlestown during the Stono Rebellion, which you may have heard of. So the 1740s were a time of really enhanced white panic over slave rebellions. Also, in January 1740, George Whitefield, a central figure in the Great Awakening, sort of the first celebrity preacher, right? He visited Charlestown, attracted great crowds to his preaching, and clashed with the Church of England's commissary, a man named Alexander Garden. Later that year, Whitefield published a letter to the inhabitants of Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, in which he exhorted slave owners to convert their slaves to Christianity and connected the dearth of Christian slaves with the spiritual deadness of South Carolina's established clergy. Whitefield's exhortations to slave owners were entirely in line with the policy of the Anglican Church, whose ministers in the colonies tried when they could to convert slaves and often wrote back home expressing sadness and that slave owners were reluctant to have their slaves baptized. This was a big debate because slave owners were worried that Christian conversion and baptism would provide an argument that the slaves should be freed. It is not surprising then that Garden did not let the accusations go unanswered, especially when Whitefield was attracting such large crowds to his sermons, and he quickly published a reply. So, it's quite clear that the Anglican Church of South Carolina was on the defensive at this point in time. As the historian Charles Bolton has pointed out, it was hardly a coincidence that in 1740, Garden wrote to London with a proposal to start a school in Charlestown for African slaves, 1 month after Whitefield had purchased 500 acres of land on the Delaware River to be used as a center for Negro instruction. So there was this sort of rivalry for moral legitimacy. While Whitefield's project did not move forward, Garden's did. And in spite of a 1740 law making it illegal to teach a slave to write in South Carolina, the Charlestown Negro School opened in 1742. Convinced that young African slaves would learn best from other slaves of the same race, Garden actually purchased 2 slaves with the express purpose of training them to be teachers. In 1746, Garden visited England and thus had ample opportunity to update interested listeners about the state of religion in the colony and the status of the new Negro school. Could the author of the New Pilgrim's Progress have met Garden on his visit to England and heard about his new school, as well as his struggle with Whitefield? Could the author be Garden or one of his associates, supporters? Such thoughts about the author's location and identity can be no more than speculative. Certainly, though, if we consider the text as a response to concerns of the established church, especially with a focus on the conversion of slaves, much that is otherwise confusing in the novel makes sense. An anti-revivalist agenda focused on South Carolina would explain why the novel is relatively blunt about slavery in Jamaica, where a white character explains to Walcott, "We live with slaves in a kind of warfare and are obliged to keep them low, for fear their pampered spirits should urge them to a rising." but fails to show similar frankness about South Carolina, really an equally brutal regime. Jamaica appears as a cesspool of decadence, cruelty, and deism, providing an occasion for Walcott to establish his credentials as a sincere, if naive, clergyman interested in the welfare of slaves. It serves as a foil to South Carolina, which in the novel, although certainly not in reality, is presented as a site of benevolence. In South Carolina, slavery is an understated background feature of the landscape. Slaves appear only when they are needed to advance the plot by converting to Christianity. And Walcott only has praise for its white residents. I found the merchants, and indeed the lowest tradesmen, to be affable, civil, and obliging, not in the least resembling the common run of Jamaica. It's almost like this competing advertisement for colonists. Come emigrate to South Carolina. That the text is ultimately concerned with defending the Anglican Church's outreach to African slaves in an era when many slave owners still resisted such outreach, would also explain the near invisibility of actual blacks in the novel. The novel finds ways of fantasizing about the religious salvation of slaves without contemplating the slaves themselves. The Indian convert of the novel's title is crucial to this task. So Walcott's establishment of a school for the children of neighbors and their slaves echoes Garden's real school. And in training the slave to be a missionary, Walcott validates the real project of Garden. But Galashman, an exotic import from Asia with no apparent roots, attachments, longings to return home, he provides imaginative displacement from the black-white binary that organized South Carolina population and that provoked constant fears of slave rebellion. His lighter color, his isolation from others of his kind, and his benevolent treatment allow for an abstraction from the realities, the hard realities of chattel slavery, and perhaps gather more affection from a white audience. So in other words, the author is trying to please people in London interested abstractly in the conversion of slaves without upsetting slave owners back in South Carolina. To some degree, the Czech Bateau Indians serve the same function. Relatively minor players in the novel, they still receive more attention than any blacks. The reason is clear, given the circumstances of South Carolina in 1748. The conversion of the large and thus frightening slave population remains controversial. And yet, in the Great Awakening's contest for spiritual rectitude, imperative. In contrast, the conversion of Indians is regarded as so remote from reality as to range beyond controversy into fantasy. Indians thus upstage Africans as model converts because such an event is too remote from perceived reality to be anything but comforting and entertaining. They provide Galashman, the slave missionary, with his ultimate credentials. He competently recuperates them from the edges of civilization, and they open to the reader's gaze, the very preaching that is obscured with his black converts. Heathen converts, the text suggests, beget more heathen converts, with dividends of peace for the colony. And throughout the text, Walcott's and Galashman's approaches to mission buttress an anti-revivalist stance. Ultimately, then, this novel delivers to readers a comforting vision of how Christian mission could unfold in the colonies if only the right agent materialized to launch it. Galashman's status as exotic racial outlier allows the novel to deliver a fantasy of heathen conversion taking place with minimal effort and with almost complete displacement from the moral complexities of slavery, colonial encroachments, and racial tensions that were all too present in 18th century South Carolina. His story also is an anti-revivalist exemplar. This fantasy is presented in service of the most pressing concerns faced by the colonial Anglican Church at mid-century, defending itself against criticisms from evangelicals. Heathen converts, whether African slaves, Asian imports, or fairly distant Indians, provide the Anglican Church of this colony with the ultimate validation. The New Pilgrim's Progress was a text hiding in plain sight, waiting to tell us what it could about the 18th century Atlantic world, as well as about the early novel. Libraries and archives are filled with such texts. To study and teach the literature of an earlier era is in part to be anchored in a love for and understanding of what we typically call the classics, the works acknowledged over time to be great, meriting repeated reading and transmission to readers who follow us in time. Such labor also involves a dynamic engagement with the past, however, as we find the texts that have slid into obscurity, even those that were obscure in their time, but that for reasons both historical and aesthetic draw our interest today. Many hundreds of the popular fictional stories that came to be novels for their novelty to the world were published over the 18th century. Something like 50 of them, with a particular focus really on about 20, tend to be taught in university courses today. So we really only tend to read a small fraction of what was published. And these are days in which we think of ourselves as having expanded a traditional canon, for example, with more attention to women authors. To teach and to study is to select, and necessarily to neglect the vast bulk of what we could show to our students. If my story contains a moral, it is that the purpose of the scholar is not just to find and collect information, but to interpret it, to determine what is meaningful and why, and to bring that meaning to the attention of other readers. Our vision of the past and of our cultural heritage is a dynamic and living thing, altering over time as we learn more and as we rediscover what has been forgotten. Scholars, archivists, researchers keep our connection to that past, but they do so in a way that keeps us moving forward in our engagement with that past, as we should. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions about the book or about the process of looking for a book like this one. Yes?
Does the ESTC now know that there is a copy of this?
No, and I think that has to do with the ongoing cataloging efforts in the Gilcrease. I see, is that Renee in the back? To put you on the spot, but I think I think that will be a process that will occur hopefully in the future.
Wasn't there pressure to, at this time or maybe just after, to bring over a Church of England bishop and
yes.
women in America? That was a huge
issue.
Controversy.
So a huge obstacle to the Church of England in America was that to be ordained, a clergyman needs to be ordained by a bishop. And there was no bishop in North America. And there was ongoing discussion throughout the century about bringing a bishop to North America. One of the problems was that the dissenting colonists were outraged at this possibility and were very frightened that the establishment of a bishop in the colonies would be a harbinger of an established church and the imposition of the state church that many of those colonists had gone to America to escape. And that actually was an issue in the buildup of tensions to the American Revolution. And no bishop was established until right after the Revolution, I think 1783 in Canada. So that was a huge issue, and it was a logistical nightmare. You know, just to get someone ordained, they had to go all the way to England and back, and sometimes die along the way.
When you refer to anti-revivalists, can you explain, define that?
Yeah, so this is a whole part of the article I just didn't really get into, but the novel is really spends a lot of time stressing that there's a lot of suspicion of anything that is quick or emotional in the process of Christianization. And so Hatem Galashman takes about 4 years to be baptized. and he learns several languages. He reads the Bible backwards and forwards, and of course there's a lot of emphasis not just on the Bible, but on the Book of Common Prayer of the Church of England. So there are also references to Walcott and Gelashman studying indoors, because the revivalists are always out preaching on hillsides. So there's a lot in the novel arguing that rapid conversion is a suspicious and unreliable thing. And so the anti-revivalist stance is much more gradualist, even-tempered, cool, much more focused on the head than the heart.
Why do you think that he chose this ambiguous Asian identity for taking a Native American?
Yeah, it really is just it's such a weird part of this text. And there were it's not as though East Indian or Chinese captives actually were popping up on Spanish galleons in 1748 and being shipped to South Carolina. There's just no rooting in fact.
When didn't Indians start to come into Trinidad? When was that?
That was later,
That
partly
was all
because
later.
that was an outgrowth of emancipation of slaves. They needed more labor, yeah. So part of my argument is that it's too controversial to talk about actually converting slaves and to actually talk about converting the Indians at this point in South Carolina, because the whites are so afraid, because they have such a minority status. They're so vastly outnumbered. And so the argument I'm developing is that just importing, it's almost like this alien from Mars, like this completely foreign figure. He has no connection to the world around him. He has no family or community that he's part of, no attachment to his home culture, no homesickness. It's almost like he's divinely sent. And so it provides this, almost like this deus ex machina. It provides a way to have all the advantages of a non-white minister and missionary without the political baggage.
So you need some sort of exotic, but is there any at all ever discussion about any of the beliefs that this person?
Oh, no.
Nothing.
Beliefs? Please, no.
No, that individual is being converted.
Sorry?
I mean, the individual is being converted has no.
No. They're just
Okay.
tabula rasa, blank slates. And that's what I'm arguing is part of the fantasy structure, is that these are not figures treated as real human beings with their own real cultures. So, yeah.
Do you get the impression that the author had been to South Carolina, or just totally a fantasy written in English?
The description of South Carolina is rather precise, and there's a description of the church that was actually there. And so I have this sense either that it was someone who had been to South Carolina or who had had a very precise description of Charlestown, the town, and the colony, which is partly why I think I would not go so far as to hazard a guess about the identity of the author, but I feel very strongly that the novel emerged somehow from Garden's visit to London and his efforts to sort of drum up support for his work.
He has a master's degree. AM.
Yes, yes. Well, he's an Oxford divine. So when we first encounter him, I believe he's still in Oxford, and he hasn't. He's working as in a local church, but hasn't. And it seems like he might be lined up for a comfortable living. And so it's this signal of his religious sincerity that he feels he has this calling to, quote, go convert heathens. So he gives it all up.
Do we know who financially backed him?
The author?
The church?
Oh, no, and that's one of the mysteries. We just don't know. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily require a lot of financial backing to write a novel. But I do feel, and this is something I'd like to research a bit more, it's a little unusual to have a book published simultaneously at a London and a regional press.
Yes.
that feels to me like someone who may have had some connections with some printers. And so I feel like whoever the author was, I feel like someone with some means and power in the church was able to pull some strings, but I'm not sure. Well, it was a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for hearing me out. I love to talk about the process and the results of rare book research.